To rediscovering their ancient pasts, some countries only need to study their monuments. But for nations like Ireland, that distant history is a bit more difficult to uncover. Still, there's one burial ground that has puzzled archaeologists for generations, and thanks to cutting-edge technology, experts have picked up on hidden details. But will some wish that this past remained a secret? Irish tomb reveals truth about the country's past. Not unlike Egypt, Ireland has its own Valley of the Kings, a wind-swept and rocky expanse where great chieftains were laid to rest thousands of years ago. Its most famous tomb almost blends in with the countryside. Of all these burial sites, some of which date back to 7,000 years ago, Newgrange is the crown jewel. This giant mound was rumored to be the home to some gods, and it appears to align with some astral bodies. Its deepest chambers contain human remains. No modern scientist had been able to decode Newgrange's meaning, but Dr. Daniel Bradley of Trinity College believed he could succeed where so many others failed. The geneticist emerged as one of the foremost experts in ancient DNA and surveyed the mound with his colleague Laura Cassidy. Granted, it wasn't like the Trinity researchers were breaking new ground. County Meath residents had known about Newgrange for centuries and sometimes borrowed stone from the structure for their own homes, while a proper archaeological excavation began in 1962. Was there anything left for Bradley and Cassidy? The winding tunnels and rock walls of Newgrange instilled them with all the confidence they needed. Calling it a liminal space, a place that inspires a sort of awe, the Trinity team went hunting for whatever traces of DNA they could find. Measuring at 250 feet in diameter and 40 feet high, Newgrange represents a feat of Stone Age engineering. Cassidy and Bradley surmised that anyone connected to the site must have been socially prominent. And anyone buried there must have been legendary. The main underground chamber isn't impressive merely because of its size or the mound of bones found within. A skylight in the roof allows the sun to light up the room most brightly during the winter solstice. While little is known about Newgrange's architects, there was no doubt that this was the peak of their achievements. Over 200,000 tons of stone, clay, wood, and earth make up the monument, and some elements were hauled from miles away. The amount of resources and length of construction suggest that no one individual could have built this. It must have been an elite class, or perhaps an important family. This otherworldly tomb, guessed Bradley and Cassidy, must serve as the final resting place for whatever type of royalty led these ancient Irish peoples. DNA analysis would provide the clearest glimpse into their lives, as this civilization left very few discernible hints behind. All kinds of cryptic glyphs and drawings decorate the walls of Newgrange, but most of their exact meanings are lost to us. Without any sort of Irish Rosetta Stone to guide them, the Trinity researchers turned their attention to a less pleasant-looking feature. They collected samples from the bones in the main chamber. Beyond determining the date of death, Bradley and Cassidy hoped to learn where these people came from and whom they were related to. Their initial findings had no lack of intrigue. One DNA sample took their breath away. After isolating genes inherited from the person's father and mother, Bradley and Cassidy were shocked to observe that many of these sequences were nearly identical. These similarities went beyond the parents hailing from the same community. They were so alike that the deceased's parents must have been from the same family. Could this prominent Irishman really have been the product of incest? Well, sibling relationships aren't just limited to Game of Thrones. While the taboo of incest was likely very much present in ancient Ireland, powerful families, like those who built Newgrange, could rise above the rules. By marrying and procreating with each other, noble brothers and sisters could consolidate power within their own family. It was not unlike how many Egyptian dynasties carried on, leading Bradley to describe the residents of Newgrange as Irish pharaohs. This finding also correlated with long-held Irish folklore. Historical records compiled in the Middle Ages mentioned a King Bressil who was in a relationship with his sister and died near Newgrange. The Trinity researchers might have verified his identity as well as the roots of Ireland. The pharaoh in this tomb had only a trace of indigenous genes in his remains, indicating that these rulers of Ireland originated somewhere else. Continued study of the site could unveil the early human migration patterns that established Europe as we know it. The discovery sent waves throughout the academic community, though not without some criticism. David Reich, an expert in prehistoric human migration, pointed out that some of the Newgrange burials occurred hundreds of years apart, gaps that could complicate any narratives about the evolution of the Irish people. Clearly, there is more work to be done. But because remnants of Ireland's earliest civilizations are buried all over the place, if you know where to look, historians have gotten more leads on the truth of Ireland's past than they suspected. Just after things were seeming to settle down at Newgrange, a turf cutter from Northern Ireland called Jack Conway went out to work on the Emla bog. At first, all looked normal, but he was about to unearth something that hadn't seen the light of day for thousands of years. While he was working, Jack's shovel suddenly hit something quite a bit harder than the peat he was trying to harvest. He quickly dug it up, especially since it would hardly be the first time that something mysterious was unearthed from the bogs before. You see, the land that became the bogs was once the intersection of three different ancient kingdoms and was thought to be a place with supernatural powers, almost like something out of a high fantasy movie. The land's mystical reputation would bring people in droves to the bogs. Feeling a spiritual connection to the land, people would often come and bury offerings to the gods for their protection. Such sacrifices weren't meant to be dug up again, but the bogs actually do have a special property people discovered centuries later. The low temperatures and high acidity of the bogs, combined with a low amount of oxygen, makes them excellent at preserving whatever is buried below. Over time, people have uncovered a veritable treasure trove's worth of artifacts from Irish peat bogs. Because the bogs prevent decomposition, old objects including tools, coins, jewelry and other thousand-year-old curios have been found in relatively good condition. The preservative properties of the bogs also made them useful for a more sinister purpose, which made Jack's initial discovery a bit worrisome. The marshy depths of the Emla bog were also particularly good at mummifying bodies. Several ancient corpses were found on the bottom of the bog, some very clearly not there by accident either. Thankfully, it became clear Jack hadn't found a body, but he still wasn't sure what he had found either. In fact, it just looked like a large, oddly shaped rock. However, there was one thing that stood out about Jack's discovery. It had a particularly odd smell to it, described as being similar to a strong but not unpleasant cheese. Unable to make any sense of the chunk buried 12 feet into the bog, Jack called in the officials from the Cavan County Museum. After properly examining it and even going as far as carbon dating the object, they finally revealed what Jack had found. It was actually butter, 2,000-year-old butter to be precise. Funnily enough, the butter had been so well preserved that it was still technically edible. But what on earth was it doing in the middle of a bog? Unlike modern bricks of salted butter that can keep fresh for a few months without a refrigerator, salt wasn't common in medieval Ireland. So the low temperatures and preservative properties of the bogs made them into a natural freezer of sorts. Hundreds of lumps of this hard butter have been discovered in containers made of animal bladders or wood, many of which also survived for thousands of years in pristine condition. But why would ancient people go through so much trouble just for a condiment? Back in medieval times, butter was actually a luxury good that people could pay their taxes and rent with. While we wish we could pay our bills with Land O'Lakes like that, there's still one important question about this ancient butter. How does it taste? First, we should probably start with the smell. While Jack described the lump he unearthed as having a fairly pleasant scent, other people were less charitable. The smell of ancient bog butter has been compared to a stomach-churning combination of spoiled milk and bad Parmesan cheese. Who would be brave enough to try tasting this then? Andrew Zimmern actually tried a bit of 3,000-year-old bog butter on his show Bizarre Foods. He described the taste as a lot of funk with a crazy moldy finish. But there are still people who can't resist trying it for themselves. The 300-year-old lump was actually brought into an Irish elementary school for the kids to taste test it for themselves. Funnily enough, they claimed it wasn't too bad. Perhaps it's more of an acquired taste? Either way, this ancient tradition is starting to catch on with locals. In fact, one local man decided he would create his own bog butter. After making 3 pounds of homemade butter, Brian Collar wrapped it in cheesecloth and buried the lump in the bog behind his house. He'd dig it up after a year of aging in the Irish countryside. The end result looks considerably more appetizing than any of the ancient ones that were unearthed. According to Brian, it has an earthy flavor that he enjoys when making eggs or drizzling it on top of popcorn. He even invited his neighbors to share it. Though the trend of debug butter probably won't catch on, many hunks continue to be discovered. You can even view a few pieces in Irish museums, just don't be surprised if they won't let you have a taste. Though these aren't the strangest places where old foodstuffs were uncovered. After sinking in a maritime battle in 1676, the Goliath ship the Cronin sat peacefully at the bottom of the ocean for 300 years. Amazingly, in 1980, an amateur researcher named Anders Franzen discovered the shipwreck's location. The Swedish government sponsored yearly archaeological dives to collect any lost artifacts. What was hidden in the ship for all that time? After a thorough search of the ship, the dive teams found a bunch of old firearms, though that was just the beginning. They also found musical instruments, including violins and trumpets, an abundance of gold and silver coins, a gold ring, and a wooden plaque with the name of the ship carved into it. Still, one particular find surpassed all the others. Just when researchers thought they unearthed nearly everything of importance, one of them came across this black tin jar nestled in the mud, and it was heavy. At first, nobody had any idea what they had stumbled across. More gold and silver coins, perhaps? When scientists finally pried open the can, an overwhelming pungent smell hit them like a putrid wall. It was almost too much to bear. They stared at the grayish lump of mush, and suddenly it hit them. It was some kind of preserved cheese product. They described the smell as a mix of yeast and Roquefort cheese. During the era when the Cronin was built, cheese was a real status symbol. It separated the rich from the poor. In this case, however, the cheese was well past its prime. The Cronin cheese sits on display at the museum, along with the rest of the findings. Since the ship was discovered in 1980, diving teams have collected over 30,000 artifacts, and they haven't even explored every nook and cranny. Maybe they'll come across a nice merlet to pair with the cheese. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.